At least two of the formative experiences of my life, two experiences that really shaped my sense of home, took place in deeply unsexy chain stores in suburban strip malls. The first was a Walmart. When I was about 5, my parents took my older brother and me to our local big box store and let us pick out our own beds. This was a really big moment. My mom and dad had arrived in the US 8 years earlier, and now they'd bought a house in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. Our new beds were going to go in their new home. If there was a section called Tacky Discount Americana, that's where we must have gone. My brother chose a red race car, and mine was a cross between a playhouse and a bed. It had like pink siding and a little blue roof tented over the mattress. I didn't just sleep in that bed. I read, played with stuffed animals, hosted a rotating cast of imaginary friends. I loved this thing that my parents had so carefully picked out with me, and they loved that I loved it. Specifically, they loved that I invented whole worlds for myself. They loved that I had a rich private life. A floor below me, when my mom wasn't working her 13-hour shifts, she was obsessing over paint swatches and considering new granite countertops. Usually her frugality would win out, and she'd postpone actually paying for a new paint job or a new counter. But she haunted local real estate, wandering through open houses, trying on someone else's life. And I get that. It's both a very immigrant and very writerly thing to do. My parents and I were both kind of playing house in our own ways. We were trying to invent our lives in a country where nothing came naturally to us. Maybe the pressure of invention is why I was such a petty tyrant in my own playhouse. When friends came over, I made them squeeze under my little blue roof and abide by my rules. I would say, today everyone is going to pretend to be 19-year-old painters. And if you wanted to be even 20 years old, I would put my foot down, like a megalomaniacal auteurish director dealing with actors who keep trying to ad-lib. But then again, the way in which I was protective of my house reminds me how vigilant my parents were about theirs. They kept track of America's shortcomings. Kids here were badly behaved. They didn't respect their elders, dated too early, drank, did drugs, and turned out to be average. None of that would fly in our house. And my parents were determined to stomp out even the most basic instinct to break rules, which meant I didn't just get in trouble for the more serious stuff like drinking. I was also always in hot water for talking back at the dinner table, for rolling my eyes, for behaving the way my white peers behaved with their parents. Nothing exemplifies this more than a significant incident that took place when I was 12, which brings me to my second chain store memory. I had gone to a Borders bookstore, remember those, with a family friend and purchased book 2 in the Meg Cabot YA series, The Princess Diaries. You might remember The Princess Diaries as the movie that starred Anne Hathaway and Julie Andrews, but it was a novel series first, and the books were way more sordid than the G-rated film. At the start of book 2, the protagonist, Mia, confesses that her mom, who has been dating Mia's algebra teacher, is pregnant, and she is not married. I remember reading this the way I read any other book when I was sitting in my little playhouse that I was getting too old for. That playhouse that until then my parents had always loved because they liked that I was imaginative and bookish. But at some point over the summer when I was reading that book, my mom picked it up and saw the first line, which read something like, "Oh my God, my mom is having Mr. Giannini's baby." My mother lost it. She had tried so hard to fortify her house against what she saw as American immorality. And then she found out that her fortress had a leak, her little daughter in that little playhouse. And suddenly my imaginative life, my private life, wasn't cute, it was dangerous. Things escalated. My mom demanded to know where I'd gotten the book. I reminded her that I'd been to Borders a few weeks earlier. Giving specifics to a raging mother is not a good idea. The detail incited her into action. And the next thing I knew, the whole family was being packed into the Toyota Camry and shuttled to the Borders Books and Music at Perimeter Mall. My mom stomped right up to the customer service desk and slammed the teal hardback down on the table. A manager arrived to be ritually berated. My mother wanted to know how her child had been able to buy such a tawdry book. It was as though they were just handing out D.H. Lawrence at Toys R Us now. The manager looked at her and looked at me, and it dawned on me that maybe he was trying to make a logical point. Could he see that this was no time for logic? Certainly not from a white stranger. Luckily, he grasped this on his own and aborted his attempt to explain the dimensions of children's and middle grade book marketing. He also didn't do what I fantasized about doing in retrospect, which was offer to give my mother a free copy of Fahrenheit 451 or 1984. He just nodded. Now, this was Georgia, so maybe he had already saved a pile of Harry Potter books from some raging evangelicals earlier that day. For all I knew, he was a raging evangelical himself. Or maybe he understood that something had violated my mother's sense of home, and he wanted to do her a kindness of letting her put it back together. He let her return the book, despite the fact that it was dog-eared. What I remember most is a sense that the people at Borders were as confused as I was. This told me that out here, in different light, perhaps I wasn't a bad kid. I was maybe just an American kid. A few months ago, my parents read my first novel, which came out this month. And in the years since The Princess Diaries, we have often disagreed, but they at least now know the ways in which I depart from their worldview, for the most part. I knew some things in my book might hurt them for the same reasons The Princess Diaries book hurt them. My narrator, who we meet at both age 15 and 26, engages in cursing, underage drinking, recreational drug use, casual sex, and perhaps most difficult, he realizes his parents' morality doesn't work for him, and he has to build his own. I worried my parents would feel, when they read this, a version of what they must have felt when I was a kid. A bit of betrayal that in my house within their house, I had been building my own imaginative and aesthetic and ethical space that wasn't theirs. In the end, they've handled the book with a lot of grace and love and even pride, which I'm very grateful for. But I keep thinking about that moment in the Borders, especially when an interviewer says to me, "It must be gratifying to think of an Indian American reading this book and seeing themselves." I think sure, but I've never been moved by the idea of merely representing someone's experience on the page. What actually brings me joy is the idea that this book could maybe help some reader feel more at home. And maybe that means that somewhere in America, there's going to be a really angry immigrant mom storming into a bookstore, slamming down my book, and asking a manager, "How dare you sell this to my daughter?" I just hope that daughter keeps reading.